On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to discuss the Jewish calendar as opposed to the calendar that Western civilization now uses. We, some 5 years ago, crossed the threshold of the sixth millennium in the year 2001. But the Jewish calendar had the year 5760. Who is right and who is wrong? Gary Stearman is here to discuss the truth of the calendars.
Fascinating topic, so stay tuned. You know, JR, that's a 240-year difference. 2000 from 5760, 240-year gap. What happened to those 240 years? Well, using various calculations based on the reigns of Gentile kings and certain historical markers, as documented by Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones in the Chronology of the Old Testament, we're going to take you on an adventure today, which I'm sure when you're through, you're going to say, wow, that explains a lot of questions I've always had in my mind.
Not only do we have the years accounted for, but we're going to tell you on today's program how the Jewish rabbis eliminated those years from their calendar. So pay close attention throughout this entire program, and you will learn something that will, I think, absolutely astound you. Now, Gary, let's begin by saying that in the year 2000, there were 6 billion people on this planet. It had doubled from 3 billion in the last 40 years, from 1960 to the year 2000. If it continues at a 40-year doubling rate, in another 240 years, by the year 2240, that would be over 400 billion people on this planet. So if the Jewish calendar is accurate, and the Messiah will come in the year 6000 to establish his seventh-day millennial kingdom, there will be too many people on this planet. There's not enough air to breathe, not enough water to drink, and not enough food to eat to sustain 400 billion people. Therefore, the Jewish calendar has to be wrong, and the calendar that Western civilization now uses has to be correct. And we're going to tell you how all this came about.
Well, JR, this is fascinating because there is a work called the Seder Olam Rabbah, the book of the order of the world, or the order of the ages. And what it is just basically a date book, a Jewish date book in which a rabbi back in the 2nd century, his name was Rabbi Halafta, set down critical dates, and the Jews have relied upon those dates from that time until this. Now, let's just talk about a date marker for a moment, and here would be a good one. Let's go from creation to the birth of Abraham. Now, that's a great place to start calculating, and by the way, the author of the book, Dr. Jones, shows us, based upon Ussher's chronology and a comparison with the Seder Olam Rabbah, he shows us that there is a gap there. JR, explain that.
There's a 60-year gap. The Seder Olam Rabbah, the Jewish calendar, says that Terah, the father of Abraham, was 70 years old when Abraham was born. And according to the scriptures here, Terah begat Abraham, Nahor, and Haran after his 70th year. So they say, okay, Abraham was the firstborn, and so he was born when Terah was 70. However, if you will take verse 32, the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. And then the following verses in chapter 12, verse 4, for example, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. That would make Terah 130 years old when Abraham was born, not 70. So there's a 60-year gap there. I believe our calendar is correct, and the Jewish calendar is wrong there.
And so we've already found 60 of those 240 years.
Yes.
And we can go from here and look at some other events and just begin to add other gaps to that 60 years, and eventually we'll arrive at the 240.
Yes. There is another dating that I think is pertinent. According to Ussher, from the birth of Abraham to the Exodus was 505 years. And according to the Seder Olam, there was only 500 years. So there's a shortfall of 5 years. And by the way, Abraham was 75 years old when the covenant was made. And according to the book of Exodus, chapter 12, verses 40 and 41, it was 430 years later to the day that the Jews went out of Egypt. The Passover, new moon or full moon of Nisan in that particular year, 430 years. And Galatians 3:17 also agrees with that. It's 430 years. However, according to the Jewish calendar, there's a 5-year discrepancy there as well. So now we have 65 years found of the 240.
Now, the next date marker that we investigate is the marker from the Exodus to the laying of the foundation of Solomon's temple. From Exodus to the building of the temple.
Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. Actually, 480 years, both agree. There is no discrepancy. According to our Gentile chronology, or actually James Ussher, the man who wrote this Annals of the World, published in 1653, he is absolutely on target here. He is correct, agrees with the Seder Olam Rabbah, but the next set of dates has a 17-year discrepancy, Gary.
It does.
And that would be from the foundation of the first temple to the consecration of the second temple.
And Bishop Ussher says that was 497 years, 1012 to 515 BC. The Seder Olam says that was 480 years, 831 to 351 BC. So now we add another 17 years. Now we're up to 82 years total. 82
years on this 240-year discrepancy between the two calendars. And the reason for the 17 years here, according to Dr. Jones, Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones, and the chronology of the Old Testament, the reason for this is the difference between the kings of the northern 10 tribes and the dating of the kings of the southern 2 tribes. The Seder Olam has a different set of calculations than what the Scripture has and what profane history also gives us from those early dates. So there's another 17 years discrepancy. But the big problem comes with the final, shall we say, somewhere around 154 years discrepancy, beginning, of course, with the Persian Empire. And that's where it really gets sticky, Gary, and there's a reason behind all of this. There is another 150-something years that the Seder Olam just lops off and disregards, that we can prove, absolutely prove, from this book, the Annals of the World, and from Herodotus, the Greek historian, and from other historians that are quoted in this book.
By the way, at this point, you might be interested in knowing that Bishop Ussher, in the Annals of the World, used very careful historical documentation. It's astounding when you read the book, J.R., as you have done. You just are amazed at what the man did to document his dates. They are linked unequivocally to certain Gentile events. And we're now talking about roughly the period from the Second Temple, which was destroyed in the Babylonian captivity, and all the way up to the destruction of the Third Temple, the Temple of Herod, by the troops of Titus. So you take this period from roughly the rebuilding of the Second Temple to the destruction of Herod's temple in the days following Jesus' crucifixion, and now you're talking about a very flexible period. That is, if you view it from the Jewish perspective. If you view it by the reigns of Gentile kings, it's a different story.
Yes. Now, once Ptolemy comes to power upon the death of Alexander the Great, history is locked in. There's not much the Jews can do to change that.
Right.
They do have a 10-year discrepancy there. History says that it was 331 BC. The Seder Olam says it was 321, 10 years difference there. But their main problem comes in the Persian period. They list only 5 Persian kings. You may recall now, Belshazzar was killed in 538 BC. Darius and Cyrus took over the Babylonian Empire and established the kingdom of the Medes and Persians, 538. And that date is not so well fixed in the Jewish calendar. They say that it came in 374 BC. We're going to tell you how the difference came about when we return in just a moment. Why is the Jewish calendar 240 years at variance from the calendar used by Western civilization? We're going to tell you why. We've already accounted for 82 years. Now we want to tell you about the remaining years. And as you can see in Bishop Ussher's book, The Annals of the World, he spends this many pages talking about the Persian Empire. And the Jews lop it off to a mere 53 years instead of 207 years, which, as you can see, profane history, Roman history, Greek history, the Greek historian Herodotus lists in great detail. And so we want to talk to you about that in this segment of our program. Gary?
It's very illustrative, as pointed out by Dr. Jones, to just begin with the reign of Darius the Mede. Now, the Seder Olam, the JR, says that he reigned from 374 to 373 BC. That is 1 year. Yes. 374, 373. Secular history documents it entirely different way.
Yes, 538 BC. In the book of Daniel, when Belshazzar was overthrown and the Medes and the Persians took over the kingdom, the year was 538 BC, not 374 BC.
Yes.
Okay? From that point, the Seder Olam has 5 Persian kings, a total of 53 years in the Persian Empire, until Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian kingdom, and it actually was 207 years, not 53. Instead of 5 kings, as listed in the Seder Olam, there were 13 kings, and they are all documented by Greek history right here, Herodotus in particular, and of course, we're talking details here. What happened this year, that year, next year, the next. Every year is accounted for here in this Annals of the World by Bishop James Ussher. By the way, you can get this through our ministry, and I hope you will take advantage of it. You can also get this book called The Chronology of the Old Testament by Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones through our ministry. We have both of them listed in our magazine this month. This is the July edition. You can get a copy of it by calling the number at the bottom of your screen. And while you're on the line, ask the operator about the Chronology of the Old Testament for $24.95 plus shipping and handling. And also this Annals of the World, which I think both will make a fascinating study for you if you want to know about the history of the human race from Adam through the destruction of the temple in AD 70.
Oh, and JR, don't forget to tell them that the book, The Chronology of the Old Testament, also contains a CD-ROM. You insert that in your computer's reader, and guess what? You get virtual wall-sized charts. It's amazing.
Yeah. Here it is. You can see it, a CD-ROM with all of the charts, and usually CD-ROMs like this sell for $24.95. Both together for $24.95, such a deal. I hope you'll get it. This is a fascinating study. Gary, we don't have the time in this program to list all 13 kings and their dates, but I'm going to be writing an article for our next magazine, the August magazine, which will list all of this, the difference in the chronology, the truth behind the calendars.
Now, let's get to the question. The result of this shortening of the span of the Persian Empire is of absolute paramount importance. It's literally a foundational building block to the interpretation of Bible prophecy, JR, because Daniel 9:25 and following lists 70 weeks of years.
Yes.
And this greatly affects the way you view those years. In other words, if you shift the reigns of the Persian kings, then you blur the time of the coming of the Messiah.
Yes.
This is very critical.
So, for that, we go to the 2nd century, and the fact that this Seder Olam was written following the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, if you'll recall your history, Rabbi Akiva declared Bar Kokhba to be the Jewish Messiah. He started the revolt in 132 AD. In 135, he was killed by Hadrian and the Roman army. And following those years, a student of Rabbi Akiva, who, by the way, was called the father of the Mishnah, a 2nd century Jewish commentary on the Torah, Rabbi Yossi ben Halafta wrote the Seder Olam. And he changed these dates in order to make Daniel's 70 weeks end up with Bar Kokhba being the Messiah instead of Jesus Christ. What an amazing turn of events.
Meaning that they knew that that prophecy was a valid prophecy, and they basically shifted history ever so slightly.
Yes.
To make their man the Messiah. Now, that's an amazing thought. But, J.R., it does tie into several biblical thoughts. For example, and let me pull my Bible out here, in Jesus in Luke 21:24 made this statement about the Jews, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. This is the period of Bar Kokhba that we're talking about. And he says, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So we're talking about a period called the times of the Gentiles, which basically came in and became the timing system used in this era.
Yeah, fulfilling that gap between Daniel's 69th and 70th week. But backing up to chapter 19 in verses 41 through 44, Jesus in his triumphal entry said, "Oh, Jerusalem, you've been blinded. If only you knew the time of your visitation."
Right.
He was referring to Daniel's 70 weeks in chapter 9.
Now, Paul comes along much later, and he says in Romans 11:25, "I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." And this blindness in part, J.R., I think plays right into this calendrical difference.
Yes. Now, this important changing of the dates, eliminating 154 years in the Persian period in order to make Daniel's 70 weeks come out to Bar Kokhba instead of Jesus being the Messiah, has been commented upon. Rabbi Simon Schwab made this statement: "It should have been possible that our sages, for some unknown reason, had covered up a certain historic period and purposely eliminated and suppressed all records and other materials pertaining thereto. If so, what might have been their compelling reason for so unusual a procedure?" He said, "Nothing short of a divine command could have prompted those saintly men of truth to leave out completely from our annals a period of what he called 165 years, and to correct all data and historic tables in such a fashion that the subsequent chronological gap could escape being noticed by countless generations, known to a few initiates only who were duty-bound to keep the secret to themselves."
Wow.
Now, Gary, this difference between the Jewish calendar and our calendar, the calendar of Western civilization, was for one purpose. They don't want Jesus being the Messiah. They want Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah.
And you notice what Rabbi Schwab says here: nothing short of a divine command could have prompted those saintly men of truth to leave that period out. Now, we have the divine command in Holy Scripture where Jesus pronounced blindness upon the house of David, right there in Luke 21.
Now, the fascinating thing about all of this is that today the rabbis believe that the Messiah is due imminently. Do you remember Kaduri, Rabbi Kaduri? He said the Messiah's got to be here in the next couple of years. Well, then that means they know their calendar is wrong.
They do. In fact, Rabbi Yitzhak Kaduri, who is said to be the leading mystic alive today in the land of Israel, it has flatly stated the coming of the Messiah is very near, and J.R., he's following a tradition that states that this must happen in the 6th millennium.
Furthermore, in the 13th century, 700 years ago, the rabbis wrote that when the 60th year crosses the threshold of the 6th millennium, then the Messiah is about to come. Now, what they mean by this is the year 5760 crossed the threshold in the year 2000. They knew even then, 700 years ago, that their calendar was off, deliberately off. We'll be back in just a moment.